All right, so we're now going to talk about buying a house and the steps that you go through from the very beginning to closing on your house. Okay, before we get into that, I want to go into some details just to give you a little bit of exposure to these ideas, and then we'll double back on these later on when we have a bit more understanding of what these terms mean. So, a mortgage is basically just a financial agreement to borrow money in order to purchase a home. All right, and so this is usually going to be set up between you, the home buyer, and a bank. If for any reason you stop making payments, well, then the house essentially serves as collateral and the bank gets to keep the house. So let's say 5 years into a mortgage, I've been making my payments, but then I lose my job. And because I wasn't making good financial strategies, I don't have any sort of emergency fund or anything, and I just stop making payments, the bank is going to get the house and sell it. And I'm out of luck as a buyer, right? Not only have I lost the house, but I've kind of given up all of that money that I've put into the house over time. If you've ever seen a foreclosure, that's usually what happened. A foreclosure is just a house that a bank is selling because the borrower stopped making payments, okay? Crucial to the idea of a mortgage is a down payment. And this is an upfront payment made by the borrower. It's kind of a unique situation that mortgages have, and some loans are set up this way, but it's kind of strange when you think about it. They're lending you money, but you have to give them money in order to lend you money. It's a little bit weird, but there's definitely a reason for these down payments. The down payment basically does two important things. One, it serves as a signal, okay? If you have no money and you try to get a loan, you're not going to be able to get a loan because banks know that if you have no money, you're not really financially secure enough to be borrowing money for a house. If instead you go to a bank and you say, I'd like to buy a house and I have $100,000 in cash sitting here, the bank knows that you're more financially secure, you're more responsible, most likely, and so you're the type of person they want to loan money to. So part of what the down payment accomplishes is it shows that you are financially responsible, the type of person who the bank wants to give a loan to, okay? The other thing it does is it basically incentivizes you to keep making payments. I'll go ahead and say up front that a traditional mortgage, kind of mixing terms here, but a traditional mortgage has a 20% down payment. Okay? And so what this means is if a house has a value that you're purchasing for, I don't know, let's say a $300,000 house, what that means is you would have to have $60,000 to make your down payment. Okay? So when you actually close on your house, when you secure your loan from the bank, you're going to pay $60,000 up front to initialize the mortgage. Now, of course, at that point, you're only going to owe $240,000 because your $60,000 is attributed to the house. So now you owe $240,000. So it's not like you've lost the down payment. It's just the down payment now goes towards the house. Now think about what this does. If at this point you stop making payments, the bank gets the house, you lose the house. This is a financial disaster for you, right? If at this point you stop making payments, you lose the house, what that means is you've basically just given up $60,000. So this down payment here incentivizes you to keep making payments. Because you know you've already poured $60,000 into the house, you certainly don't want to default. You certainly want to keep making payments. If we take away this down payment and just say there's going to be no down payment, you can see why this would be the opposite, okay? In this scenario here, you could just stop making payments and you don't really lose anything because you haven't put any money into the house. So the down payment, again, serves two important things. One, it shows the lender that you're responsible, you have the ability to earn and save money. And two, it incentivizes you to keep making payments so that banks aren't overrun with foreclosures. All right, so traditional mortgage has a 20% down payment. All right, kind of going back to this idea, or more. All right, a traditional mortgage has a 20% down payment or more. If you go less than 20%, which we might call a non-traditional mortgage or an FHA loan, if you go less than 20%, then effectively, and there's no set name for this idea, but if you go less than 20%, you now have to pay PMI, which is private mortgage insurance. Basically what this means is, if you pay less than 20% on your down payment, the lender sees you as risky. And so since you're risky, they would really like to figure out a way to reduce risk, right? Everybody wants to get rid of risk when they can. So if you only put down 5% on a down payment, you are a very risky borrower for the lender. And so what the lender kind of does is they charge you insurance. They make you pay the insurance so that if you walk away, if you stop making payments, the bank is still guaranteed to get payments by the insurer. Okay, a lot of times this is done through actually the U.S. government. It's called an FHA loan, Federal Housing Authority, and you could go as low as 3.5% on your down payment. So on a $100,000 house, you could go as low as $3,500 as your down payment. All right. Okay, all right, it could be reasonable to do that in some circumstances. However, you will be punished in a way because this PMI costs you money, okay? This PMI is usually 0.5 to 1% added in effective interest to you, okay? So if you obtain a mortgage that's charging you a 5% interest rate, when you have PMI, it'll essentially be like a 6% mortgage, okay? So it's going to cost you more in the long run when you buy a house with a lower down payment because of this PMI. The good news is, as you make payments on the home, eventually you will have built up more and more payments. And when you hit the 20% threshold, when you've effectively paid for 20% of the house, the PMI does go away. So you will not pay it for the length of the mortgage, but you will pay it up front. Okay? So this is all to say, when you're thinking about buying a house, down payment is a big consideration. For a lot of people, it's hard to save up enough money for a traditional mortgage, and they end up going with one of these non-traditional mortgages instead. What's best? It's hard to say. Obviously, a traditional mortgage is better because you pay less, but it's not always feasible to save up 20% to buy a house. So you basically just need to know how the system works and make a good decision based on the information you have. We'll come back to this in a little bit. I just wanted to give you just enough information to take us through the process. So with these mortgages, you're going to make monthly payments over time. Some people like to think instead of paying rent, you're paying mortgage. Okay, so a mortgage payment just means you're paying the bank back for the loan. And a lot of times mortgages encompass other things that you're charged. They often include your insurance payments, just regular home insurance payments, and property taxes. A lot of times the banks will really, just for your convenience, lump it all together into one payment, okay? So when you pay your mortgage, you're paying for the stuff you are required to pay every month. So let's go through the process here of buying a house, okay? Sort of thinking about the very beginning all the way up until you've purchased your home. The first thing you're probably going to want to do is find a realtor. That's probably the first step you're going to make. Some people like to try to buy a house without a realtor, but you'll find out that buying a house without a realtor can be overwhelmingly difficult. Realtors do a lot for you, okay? They handle the negotiations so you don't have to. They handle the paperwork. A lot of this paperwork is very formal. Writing up these contracts is very difficult for somebody who doesn't have any experience. So, a first-time home buyer might be thinking, I'm going to try this without a realtor, because realtors are expensive. But you'll learn that it's really hard to do this. The first time you buy a house, you're just going to be so unprepared to deal with the problems that come about with these types of transactions. So they're going to help you with negotiations. You're not going to be talking to the buyer, or rather, you're not going to be talking to the seller at all. I guess I've purchased 3 houses, and in all 3 circumstances, I did not talk to the seller at all until we were signing the paperwork to agree to the purchase, okay? Which is good, because it keeps the emotions out of it. When you're meeting with the seller, you may feel more compelled to give a higher price. You may argue some. It ends all of that. When you have a realtor, the realtor's handling it. It's like your own personal agent for the contract. So they're going to help you with the negotiations. They're going to help you with the paperwork and everything. They are basically an expert in the market, in whatever housing market you're in. You would not want to have a real estate agent from Milledgeville help you with a purchase of a house in New York City, because they don't know enough. But basically, a real estate agent for any given city is going to know that city very well, and so they're going to know what a reasonable price is. If you tell them some stuff that you're looking for, they're probably going to help you find the region that suits your needs best. They're going to know a lot more than you do, okay? And so they're going to give you a lot of advice, and they're going to show you houses, which is something that's really hard to do on your own, okay? If you're trying to look at a bunch of houses in one day, your real estate agent's going to have basically be able to get into all these houses. They're going to have keys to get into the houses, and that's not something you can do as just a regular person, right? If I just try to go see some random house and just walk in with a key, I could just go in and steal stuff. So they're not going to give you that ability. It's possible to buy a house without an agent, but it's really tricky to go through these steps. So you're almost certainly going to want to have a realtor, okay? Realtor fees usually are about 3% of the purchase price. It's different in different places, but in Georgia, a lot of times this is what you're going to see. It's usually 3% of the purchase price, and that fee often isn't paid by you. It's not like you just pay the realtor for their work. A lot of times it's built into the contract. In fact, it's almost always built into the final contract. So a lot of times the seller will actually pay the realtor fee. But that being said, you might expect the house to end up costing you a bit more because the seller knows they have to pay your realtor fees, if that makes sense. So this is going to be clumped into the closing costs, which is all the stuff that you have to pay for outside of the house. All right, we're going to define this later on, but when you buy a house, there's the purchase of the house, and then all these other things that need to be paid for. Those are the closing costs. And so the realtor fees will be baked into the closing costs. If you sell a house, you might also use a realtor then. Then also there's usually an additional 3% fee for that realtor. So a lot of times the realtor fees come to 6% of the purchase price once you consider the buyer and seller's real estate agents, okay? Different in different markets, but that's typically how it works in Georgia. Technically, you could negotiate with your realtor and say, I'm only going to pay 2%, but that stuff's really not done very often. I will note that, you got to be careful here in regards to working with a real estate agent. You really, if possible, you want to find one that you can trust, which is easier said than done, especially if you're moving to a new area. But think about the incentives. If you're a real estate agent, do you want the buyer to buy a house or not? Of course you do, right? What this means is the real estate agent's usually not going to get paid unless you buy a house. So they're going to try to talk you into buying a house. And secondly, they earn more the more expensive the house is that you buy. So you could sort of imagine that if they really are being, if they're being selfish, they might not do a good job with negotiations, or they may push you to buy a house that's more expensive than you were hoping to buy. So you really want to know somebody personally, if you can, before signing them on as a real estate agent, so that you know that you can trust them. And it's easier said than done, but it's definitely something to consider. If your real estate agent's really trying to push you to buy a house, just remember that they make money off that house. And so you have to understand that they're like salesmen in a way. Okay, so you've found a realtor. Unfortunately, once you find a realtor, there's a good chance they're not just going to go out and show you a bunch of houses. First, they're going to ask you for a pre-approval letter. This is not always done in this chronological order. Let's say that you have $400,000 in the bank and you tell your real estate agent, I got 400 grand sitting in the bank. Well, then they're not going to be like, go find a pre-approval letter, okay? A pre-approval letter basically is an agreement, or let's say a written statement, better way of saying this. Basically a written statement that proves you can get a loan. And it's usually set up to a certain amount of money, okay? So you might call up a bank and you're like, I'm thinking about buying a house. And they might say, well, how much are you planning on spending? You say, $250,000. Well, then they're going to ask for a crap load of financial statements from you. They're going to ask from your bank statements for the last couple of years, your W-2s, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of things they're going to need. And then they're going to give you perhaps a $250,000 approval letter. And all that means is the bank is saying that if you want to borrow $250,000, you're going to be able to get it from that bank. Okay? I can tell you from my own experience, they will be a little bit flexible. The first time that I worked with a financial institution, they wanted to see everything. They wanted all of the proof. But when I came back around the second time, they kind of knew who I was. And at that point, they were like, you'll probably be all right. I'll go ahead and give you the pre-approval letter without seeing all of the statements. But this process can actually be rather lengthy, especially if you're not organized. When they ask for all of these statements that you need, you might find that it takes a really long time to get all that stuff organized. So I would actually argue that you should do this as the very first thing, okay? Go ahead and get your pre-approval letter first, because it could take a few weeks to get everything organized. Once you've gotten all this stuff together one time, it's usually a little bit easier the second time, because you can, hopefully at that point you're more organized. So this is just a guarantee that you can get a loan, because you don't want to waste the realtor's time. So if you don't know the realtor very well, they're going to ask for this up front. And when you go to make an offer on a house, you have to have this pre-approval letter submitted, okay? So this is going to be something you have to have. This does not mean that you are telling the bank you're going to work with them. This does not set you as a contract with this bank. It doesn't really do anything except say that you're going to get a loan, that you have the ability to get a loan. In the past, I've gotten a pre-approval letter from one bank and then didn't even use them, right? I just used them for the pre-approval letter, and then their interest rates were high, so I just moved on past them, didn't use them again. So it doesn't lock you into any sort of contract. It's just something you need so that they know you can buy the house, okay? They know you can get funds. All right, so you've obtained a pre-approval letter. Now you get to do the fun part, which is look at houses. I would argue this is the only fun part of the process. Everything else is incredibly time intensive and boring, but this part can be really fun. You're trying to figure out what you like about the house, right? This is the HGTV stuff. That's the fun part. And eventually, hopefully you find a house that you want to buy and you're going to make an offer. Okay, so making an offer. The first time I tried to buy a house, I didn't have a real estate agent or anything, and I literally called up the seller and I was like, I want to buy this house. I'll give you $50,000 for it. It was like a cheap apartment. And they were like, who are you? This is not how you try to buy a house. Making an offer is a formal process, okay? So this is going to be formal. This is where your real estate agent is going to start making their bucks, all right? This is where they're going to start providing services to you in a very meaningful way. This formal offer is basically going to be like a written contract. It's going to include a bunch of details in it. Stuff that's included in this offer. Since I know we're going to run out of space, let me move up here. Stuff that's going to be included in this offer is going to be the closing dates. That's the date you will buy the house from them. So this is the date you're saying you're going to go sign the paperwork. That ends up being often something that's negotiated a lot in these contracts, because often one party wants to be later or earlier, depending on the circumstances. obviously you're going to negotiate for the price. All right, so in your offer, you're just going to say, this is the price I'm offering. We're going to close on this date. You're going to make all of the demands, knowing that chances are the seller is going to push back and want to negotiate with you on these, on the price and probably some other features about your purchase. At this point, this is when you're going to bake in the closing costs, likely in the price. You can think of it this way: when you buy a house, there's the price of the house, and then there's the price of the transaction. The closing costs is all of the stuff that you're having to pay for, either the seller or buyer or both are having to pay for, that don't have anything to do with actually buying the house directly. So if you buy a $300,000 house, that's the price of the house. But then you got to worry about, what are we going to do with those $10,000 in closing costs, okay? The stuff that's in this closing costs are loan fees, which can be pretty high, processing fees, underwriting, attorney fees, appraisal fees. There's a lot that goes in here. Realtor fees. Realtor fees not always included in closing costs, but often are. So you can sort of think of it this way. You've got all of this stuff that needs to be paid for. Who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be the buyer or the seller? So when you put in your offer, you can kind of think about these as being a collective idea. So you might say, I will pay the full price for this house. You're asking $300,000. I'm going to offer $300,000. But I want you, the seller, to pay all of the closing costs. Okay? So that's kind of how this is going to be set up. We're going to negotiate the price and the closing costs simultaneously. And these closing costs can be pretty high. This can be 2 to 5% plus whatever the realtor fees are. Realtor fees are often kind of considered separate in regards to where it's set up on the contract. Closing costs are often considered separate of the realtor fees, but you might negotiate them at the same time. Who's going to pay these realtor fees, the seller or the buyer? In Georgia, a lot of times the seller pays the realtor fees, and then the closing costs are negotiated separately, but it really is different state to state and even community to community. So I don't want you to necessarily memorize these facts, because things are different depending on where you're buying a house. All right, so we've got these closing costs that you have to negotiate for. In addition to that, you've got appliances. All right, a lot of stuff you might not normally think about here if you've never bought a house, but is the fridge going to come with the house? Is the washer? Is the dryer? There may be other things to consider here. Hot water heater, that's almost always included. But this stuff needs to be laid out in the contract, okay? And this may be something you negotiate for. The house that I live in now, you know, we negotiated for everything. We're completely in agreement, and there's just one more thing I asked for. I said, I want the washer and dryer, right? I said, I agree to all your terms, but I want the washer and dryer with the purchase. And for whatever reason, the seller said, I don't really want to give you the washer and dryer, but I'll knock $500 off the price of the house. I said, okay. So you're going to negotiate these things, and a lot of times these end up being a lot of the sticky wickets when it comes to deciding how this stuff will be handled. You might ask for improvements, right? You might say, you know, the washer and dryer don't work, so I want a new one. Not an uncommon thing to do. You might say the floors are terrible in one of the rooms. I want the floors redone. It's all pretty common stuff to ask for. So you might ask for improvements here. You're going to agree to the earnest money. And this is basically the money you put up kind of hard to describe what the earnest money does. And the role of the earnest money can be a really important, or it can be a practical non-issue. But this is basically good faith money. Earnest money works in this way. I'm not even going to try to write this out, so make sure you're just understanding what I'm saying here, because I think I can explain it better than I can write it. If I buy a $200,000 house, a lot of times the earnest money will be 1% of the purchase price, $2,000. So what happens is I make an offer on the house, and I say I will include $2,000 in earnest money. The logic of the earnest money is, if for some reason, really late in the contract, like 2 days before closing, I say, I don't want to buy the house anymore. Well, at that point, I am obligated to give the seller that $2,000 in earnest money. It's good faith money showing that I really am serious about buying the house. Otherwise, I could just jerk them around, right? I can say, I'm going to buy the house, agree to all our contracts, then right when we go to sign, I'm going to be like, never mind, I don't want to buy it, right? Real jerk move. The earnest money protects against that because the buyer is not going to want to lose $2,000. The actual size of the earnest money can be negotiated. It could be a small amount, it could be a large amount. I'm actually in the process of selling a house right now, 4 months from now. The contract is 4 months from now. That's when we're actually going to close on the house. I'm afraid that the seller at that point I'm afraid the buyer might say, I don't want to buy the house 4 months from now. Maybe something happens. Maybe the economy collapses. Well, I made them put down a much bigger earnest money because if they back out for some reason, I don't want to get completely screwed over, right? I want the contract to go through 4 months from now, and if it doesn't, I want some compensation for having left the house under contract for such a long period of time. So in that example I just gave, the earnest money is a big deal because the contract's way in the future. Chances are when you buy a house, earnest money won't really be such a big deal because the contract will be faster and you're basically just putting that money up there showing that you're serious, showing that you'll lose something if you walk away from the contract. All right, that being said, the earnest money is not going to be relevant during what's called the due diligence period. You can see how everything in personal finance seems simple until you dive in. All of the stuff to think about here, and this is stuff I certainly didn't know when I was buying my first house. So the due diligence period, this is the period where the buyer can walk away for any reason and actually retain their earnest money. All right, this is the period where the buyer can back out with no penalty. All right, during this period here, this is when you're going to get your house inspected. Almost always when you buy a house, you're going to want to get a home inspection. You want a professional to go in and see what's wrong with the house. There's 2 reasons you want to do that. 1, because they might find a big issue that makes you not want to buy the house. And 2, they're probably going to find an issue that you can use as leverage in your negotiations. So they go under the house, they find out there's damage in the crawl space, there's some problems with the foundation of the house, you might ask for $5,000 knocked off the purchase price, okay? I can tell you personally, I have been under contract. I've gone through all of these steps 4 times, 4 different houses, okay? I bought 3. One time I entirely backed out. We did the house inspection. There was just too much wrong. I just entirely backed out of the contract, okay? Very happy I got that house inspection, right? Saved me from this huge headache. One time, I bought the house with asking for nothing else. We went through this due diligence period. They came out and inspected the house. There was nothing wrong with it. Everything looked good in the contract. I said, well, let's just keep on moving on, right? No new contracts needed to be written. The 2 other times, all right, so one time I backed out. Another time the contract went through as expected. The 2 other times, and this is the most common, is there were some problems found that I wanted addressed. There were issues, problems with the house that I thought needed to be fixed. All right, in both cases, what ended up happening was they knocked off a significant amount of the overall house price and ended up paying less for the house. So what ends up happening a lot of times is when you're here, you end up going all the way back to making an offer. You start back at number 4. All right, so you go through the due diligence period. You say, I'd like to withdraw my offer. I'd like to make a new offer on the house. And you'll go all the way back through and start over, okay? During this process, there's often several rounds. The first house I bought, I think there were 4 rounds. I made 4 offers. The sellers made 3 counter offers. So we had 7 contracts on the table before we agreed to a final contract. And that's not atypical. That's a pretty typical thing to happen. As the buyer's trying to buy the house, they're going to get more and more information during this period. And as they get more and more information, there's probably things that they want addressed. Okay, so let's think about where we're at. Step 1, we found a realtor. Step 2, we got a pre-approval letter. Step 3, the fun part, we got to look at houses. And step 4, we've made an offer, and hopefully we have finally agreed on an offer, okay? So 5, we agree to an offer and have the due diligence period that we just discussed. This is that period. That due diligence period is where you might drop out, okay? But it's a very crucial part of the process because it's where you're going to get the chance to really decide if you want to buy the house or not. Remember, if you back out during the due diligence period, which is usually 1 to 2 weeks, if you back out during that period, nothing happens. There's no punishment, okay? You're also going to have to be really on top of things. This is part of the reason why you want a realtor. If you don't get a housing inspection during that period and you just let the contract continue, well, then you're out of luck. You can't back out at that point. If you back out after the due diligence period, you usually are going to lose your earnest money. Okay, so this is the period where you're going to make the crucial decision: do you really want to buy the house or not? All right, so to reiterate, offering a contract, signing a contract and everything is kind of meaningless. When you really buy the house is after this due diligence period. You either let the contract continue, which after the due diligence period you're now on the hook, or you write a new contract during this period. So this is a big part of the process. At some point during this period, you're going to have to agree to a loan. A lot of times this is the step where you'd want to make it, but I would argue for you guys in this class that are really good at personal finance, you are thinking about the loan through this whole process. There's negotiations. You're going to want to shop around because you would want to find the lowest possible interest rate, right? You don't really care all that much who you're getting a loan from, but you definitely want to pay the lowest that you possibly can pay. And if you just go to a bank, if you walk inside a bank and you say, I'm buying a house, I need a loan, I'm closing on it next week, I need help right now, they're going to charge you a high interest rate because you're in a situation where you don't have much leverage. So instead, what you want to do is you want to go to 3 or 4 banks. You want to get them to shop against each other, fight against each other for the price. I found that when I negotiated, I was able to knock like 0.5% off of the interest rate that I was being charged, which in the long run is going to save a tremendous amount of money. All right, so you're going to agree to a loan, shop around, go to different banks, find a good deal. You will then have to get an appraisal by the lender. All right, at this point, you've agreed to the loan. The contract is moving forward. You're past the due diligence period. It looks like you're going to be buying this house. Well, when you buy a house, you're not really the one buying the house, right? When you think about it, it's really the bank or the lender that's buying the house because they're the one who's putting most of the money into the house. So the appraisal is basically just the bank making sure the house is worth the price you're paying. If the bank pays $500,000 for a house that's really only worth $200,000, and then you, the buyer, stop making payments, well, the bank is screwed. They have to try to sell the house, and they're going to sell it at a huge loss. So the idea of this appraisal is the bank to come out, send somebody to the house, and figure out how much it is worth. It usually costs a few $100s, and it's going to be baked into your closing cost. Okay, so this is one step where things could go awry. What's possible here is the price you agreed on is $250,000. They come out and they find that the appraisal value is only $200,000. Well, now you've got a problem. Okay. If they find out the house is not worth it, you're not going to lose your earnest money if you back out at this point, okay? But basically what this means is you cannot get a loan for $250,000. The house is not worth that. The bank is saying, we're not going to put a bunch of our money into this house when you're paying too high of a price for it because it's really our money that we're using, okay? So at this point, we're going to start the negotiations over again. You might come back and say, well, I'll pay $200,000 for it, right? That's the value of the house. The bank has determined, right, based on these appraisal experts that are really supposed to be completely disengaged from the process. They're supposed to have pure incentives, right? They just go out and figure out what the house is worth. So if they come out and say it's worth $200,000 and this is the price you've set, this contract cannot go through. You're not going to get a loan. So at this point, negotiations will start again, and the seller may decide it's just not worth it to sell it for $200,000 and no contract, right? The whole thing falls apart. That's never happened to me. Because in reality, everybody knows this is kind of scammy. In reality, the appraisals often, people making the appraisal really actually want the house to sell. And so what they'll do is they'll come out, look at the price that you're paying, and they'll say, well, the house is worth $260,000. Okay, that's what's happened to me on the houses I've bought. The appraisal has come in just higher than what I was paying, probably because they wanted to make sure the contract went through. All right, it's a good idea to have this set up this way, but it's all kind of a fix at this point, to be perfectly honest. In terms of the personal finance, you should just know that this is the part where it can fall apart. If it doesn't fall apart there, well, looks like you're buying a house. So you will reach the closing date. During this entire period, right after you've set the contract and it's agreed upon, you are under contract for this house. It will continue on until we hit the closing date. This is when you actually buy the house. Chances are you're going to go to an attorney's office. You're going to be there. The seller's going to be there. Your real estate agents are going to be there, and you're going to sign paperwork for like 2 hours. Okay? So this is where you sign everything. And after this, you own the home. It is quite a process to go all the way from 1 to 8. And what you'll notice there is there's just so many places where things can go wrong, right? You might have a disagreement about the price. You might not be able to get a loan. The appraisal may go bad. You might find problems with the house during the due diligence period. There's just so many chances for things to go wrong. So buying a house is like several month long process for a lot of people. It's not simple. And so that's why I think realtors are often worth it. They have a tremendous amount of effort to exert during this entire process. And sometimes when you're working with a realtor, you end up not buying a house and they get no profit. All right. So I'm willing to pay the 3%, understanding that in some circumstances, the realtor is not going to get paid at all if I don't buy a house. All right. So that's the steps to buy a house. We're now going to get into more of the personal finance details.